Hey guys, welcome back. This week we're talking about the fall of Reach. It was one of, if not the most significant engagement between humanity and the Covenant. But there's a catch. There's actually two different stories for the same exact battle. You have the original, covered in Eric Nyland's book, The Fall of Reach, which released before Halo CE ever came out. And then there's Halo Reach, which was the final Halo game made by Bungie. At the time, fans were actually pretty livid over the retcons, the changes in the narration and the changes in the story. And despite Bungie and later 343's attempts to merge the two, in my opinion, they will always be separate. But which then makes for the most coherent and realistic narrative? Well, join me this week as that's exactly what we talk about. I'm going to set out to demonstrate to y'all that despite all of its flaws, Halo Reach has a much better explanation for what happened to humanity's military in its destruction on Reach. Let's start with the basics. Which story tells what? Starting with the Fall of Reach, since it was the first piece of Halo media to have ever been released, much of the book focuses on the backstory of Chief and his background. Really, only the later portions detail the battle for Reach itself. Now, it can be roughly broken into two parts. The battle starts in space, and then it carries on to the surface. I won't belabor the plot too much, but overall in the story, the Covenant's main effort was destroying the planet. They knew eventually that it was a military stronghold, and they were able to do so by discovering the location by covertly tracking a UNSC ship that they had encountered in a previous battle. They jumped in at the edge of the solar system for reconnaissance, discovering that Reach, by all visible signs, was a significant military stronghold. They then pushed in much closer, and this was a brutal space fight where significant numbers of both Covenant and human ships were destroyed on both sides. Eventually, Covenant forces were able to make their way to the surface, and they fought their way to ground-based power generators that defended the overhead MAC platforms. Now, if you watched some of my earlier videos, that concept is impossible, but for the sake of fiction, we'll leave it be. Once those guns were silenced though, there's not much there protecting the planet. Chief was present in these battles, but instead of being on the surface or on a MAC platform, he was actually tasked with destroying a ship that had yet to wipe its nav drive, its nav database. Therefore, if it was exploited by the Covenant, they could have discovered additional human planets up to and including Earth. So he was on Gamma Station with a number of Marines and a few fellow Spartans fighting a very desperate pitched battle to ensure that that data would not fall into enemy hands. You can then now more or less see the tactical situation. The Covenant found Reach through more or less happenstance. Like, yes, they were, conducting reconnaissance, but they didn't necessarily know that Reach was specifically going to be there. But once they understood what it was, they engaged it in what I believe was a very costly frontal assault. They overwhelmed humanity eventually by exploiting significant weaknesses that allowed them to disable the orbital defenses. But that initial battle, they were straight up duking it out one for one with humanity. They lost a significant number of ships to the MAC platforms, the Supermax in orbit, and humanity themselves were able to use some rather ingenuity to defend themselves, like moving refit and repair stations in the way of incoming plasma torpedoes, destroying them before they were able to hit the main body of US or UNSC forces. Now, let's talk about the second story, Halo Reach the game. Like I said, this came out years down the road. A lot changed between when Halo C came out in 2001 and when Reach came out, I believe was 2008. One of the biggest differences was the length of the conflict and scope. It starts with the communication relay being disabled. Noble Team, a team of Spartan 3s, was dispatched to figure out why, and it turns out to be the Covenant. Humanity enacts what they call Winter Contingency, which is kind of their battle plan to root out and destroy what Covenant they can find. The Covenant then attacks Sword Base. Intent, there was to capture critical intelligence, but ultimately they're pushed back by Noble Team. The UNSC, after a couple weeks of reconnaissance, opts to engage the Covenant beachhead head on. This leads to a very costly battle, but ultimately the successful destruction of the Covenant cloaking systems, and a good chunk of Covenant forces in the area. However, it revealed a supercarrier, and that supercarrier, probably once it was obvious that they were A, there, and B, to protect the Covenant beachhead on the ground, committed itself to the fight, shelling the surface of Reach. This is where the battle more or less enters a critical second phase. Noble Team pushes and takes orbit in Saber fighters. They do this as part of a daring plan to use an improvised weapon to destroy the supercarrier. They're going to use a slipspace drive to make an unstable slipspace entry that would cut the ship in half. This ends up being successful despite the loss of Spar and George. However, the Covenant advance team had already relayed enough information for the bulk of the Covenant fleet to jump in at extremely close range. Shortly after the battle destroying the supercarrier, we see a cutscene of of exactly that. The story now moves into its third, final, and most tragic act. The Covenant forces are sieging major population centers. We see civilians desperately trying to escape, many of them being killed in the process. The game follows Noble Team attempting to protect them, attempting to escape New Alexandria themselves, eventually losing Spartan Cat, and realizing that more or less the planet was doomed. They are given one final tasking: to recover a fragment of Cortana from Halsey that had been studying Forerunner architecture, prevent her capture, and escape the planet. Ultimately, they would be successful in doing this, but at very, very heavy cost. Every single member of Noble Team would die in the conflict. So that's how it's told, in Halo Reach the game. Well, let's step back and explore the real military situation as it's occurring here. To me, The Fall of Reach, the book, mostly describes an overwhelming Covenant assault. There's not much strategy besides an all-out frontal attack. There's certain tactical level operations, but none that appear to be shaping the main effort. And what I mean there is, think of strategic as something that could influence the greater war. Tactical victories is cool, you defeated the adversary force in this building, in this area. It doesn't always line up with having an impact. And that's kind of what I see with the Covenant, in the sense that, sure, they're destroying UNSC forces, but there's not really a coherent strategic plan, not until the end. They kind of just run into humanity head on and see what sticks. It's only after that initial space battle where they committed huge numbers of their own ships did they move to a strategy that was a little bit more coherent, and that was their attempts to mass forces in and around the power generators on the ground to disable the MAC guns. That is a strategic effort versus a tactical effort. Now, to tie that up with the modern, in the real world, the idea of frontal assaults or wave attacks is not necessarily new. A great example is the Korean War. Chinese troops, would mass hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they would overwhelm lesser armed and trained South Korean forces in order to isolate and destroy more potent and better trained United Nations and US divisions. Now, this came with great costs. The Chinese lost an absurd amount of ground forces. If you go even further back, obviously World War I, you see massive frontal assaults as well. This to me is very similar to how the Covenant both assaulted in space and then the ground stations. The book describes thousands of troops with little thought to their survival, only fighting to destroy the power generators. But that's more or less all that was there as part of their strategy. Mass enough forces, break through the UNSC lines. Ultimately, it works. In short time frame too, it only took a day, but massive losses for the Covenant that could have been prevented. And another thing that's interesting is usually when you see these human wave or frontal assaults, especially in the modern day, it's typically because the adversary, the person conducting the assault, is limited either by technology or capability. So instead, they try to offset the disadvantage with a significant number more troops. If you have a technological communication and training advantage, which the Covenant by all means should, why would you go and lose so many of them when instead you could shape the battlefields ahead of time, making yourself more successful? And that's exactly what I think the narrative in Halo Reach describes. To me, that's the first and probably only game in the Halo series that saw the use of more advanced military tactics. For instance, we know the Covenant inserted a small number of covert forces to target and destroy communication systems, an excellent shaping operation. We know that the Covenant employed jamming to degrade UNSC forces, specifically in the Battle of New Alexandria, preventing them from mounting a coherent defense and also disrupting their ability to escape the city. We know they attacked and exploited critical sites for intelligence, like different ONI sites. They went after shipyards, launch points, preventing the UNSC's ability to get airborne and take into the fight. In particular, I like the idea of the Covenant inserting covert special operations teams ahead of the main battle. That's more or less what you would see in the real world. The only downside is what we see in Halo Reach, so not very covert. They were burned when they were discovered by Noble. Now, this is a strategy that, if we look in the real world, has been seen a bunch. When we talk about shaping operations in a strategic sense, we can look at the first Gulf War. Here, the United States and its coalition partners used AH-64 Apaches, very low level, hard to detect by radar stations, to engage and destroy Iraqi communication, search and acquisition radar sites along the border. And that kind of surprise attack stripped Iraq of the ability to see the main coalition body of aircraft that were now coming to attack nationwide. It's important to note, Iraq knew they were under attack by this point. You're not trying to hide the fact that you're attacking, you're just preventing their ability, disrupting and degrading their ability to now defend themselves. And that's exactly what you saw happen. Likewise, when we want to talk about covert teams assisting in the fight, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, special operations forces and sorted into the north of Iraq to establish communications with Kurdish forces that were friendly to the US presence. And then they would attack critical Iraqi locations. So you can see how these like traditional and non-traditional special operations elements can combine to degrade and disrupt a nation's ability to mount an effective defense. That's the name of the game that you're trying to do here. And that's what the Covenant was looking to do in Halo Reach, at least in my opinion. They wanted to take out the UNSC's ability to communicate, and then bring in their main fleet to land at predefined landing zones that already had security established. So that's how the two relate to the real world. But let's talk about why I think Halo Reach did it better. The bottom line up front is that Halo Reach paints an imperfect but more realistic, demonstration of a Covenant assault. They use advanced tactics, covert forces to destroy communication networks. They jammed the UNSC. The overall game plan of inserting special operations forces to disrupt the UNSC's eyes and ears, establish beachheads, set up security, and then bring in the main bulk of their forces, that makes a lot of sense. You're still using overwhelming power, but you're doing it in a way that preserves your force and ensures victory. On the other hand, the Fall of Reach paints a picture of a battle that's much different. The losses are at a significantly higher scale. The Covenant attacks seemingly head first, only opting to change their strategy after suffering what I would consider both heavy and completely unacceptable losses in space. But even despite this, the UNSC unable to hold the ground, and they lose almost everyone, including a massive number of strategic assets such as Spartan 2s, as well as a big portion of their navy. See, I think that the Fall of Reach told a story that made sense in Halo's lore in the early days. The reality of it is this fictional universe that we all love is a human construct. It is just a story that was created by artists and writers at Bungie, and that means that it's organic and it changes with time. Depending on your age, you may or may not remember that in the original Halo lore, Master Chief was the only remaining Spartan. The number of, human planets was a lot less. The Covenant were supposed to be seen as a much more significant threat. Humanity was on the verge of extinction. Now, they still are in the scope of the narrative, all these years later, but how and the context changed over time. For instance, look at the Battle of Harvest. That lasted for 5 years. That portion of the narration, Halo Wars came out years after CE, and that's what I mean. You can see how the story changes. It gives it a little bit more life, and frankly, I think it changed in all the right ways. That's why I believe Bungie decided to change Reach's narrative, understanding that it was probably going to upset their fans, but the story that they released, in my opinion, just tells a much better narration and narrative for how their strongest military fortress was able to fall. And instead of happening in a day, it happens over the course of weeks. Sure, there's imperfections there, they're using normal Covenant troops for soft missions. Why would you have grunts and stuff like that? You should just purely covert spec ops elites. Why are you using a super carrier when you could have used better cloaked, smaller ships? And why keep them in orbit when you can land them on the surface? But the overall idea of, disrupting the UNSC's ability to mount a defense, establishing landing zones, and then security and bringing in the bulk of the force, that's straight out of modern war playbooks. To really bring it into recent, events, let's look at the Ukraine-Russian war. In the initial battle for Kiev last year, Russian SOF attempted to destroy strategic facilities and personnel in and around the city on the first couple nights of the war. As this was happening, Russia's, some of their best trained, relatively, airborne forces attempted to seize the hostile airfields. The intent there was to, again, establish security around it and then infill the bulk of Russian forces. Ultimately, it failed because Ukraine was able to mount a very effective defense, counterattacking the field and preventing its use. But that game plan almost lines up exactly with what the Covenant were trying to do in Halo Reach. What I also like about the story is the fact that victory for the UNSC was possible, at least for a bit. If they could destroy those soft elements, the covert elites, prevent or disrupt their ability to communicate back to the rear guard, the bulk of the forces, or if the Covenant landed and they were able to destroy those beachheads or at least isolate them, forcing them eventually to evacuate. See, there's actual real-world analogs for that situation as well. If you look at World War I, Anzac, Australian and New Zealand forces spent a year fighting a devastatingly punishing campaign to seize Gallipoli, an Ottoman peninsula. And they made headway. It's not like they ran into a wall and were forced to retreat. But it was 1 year of brutal fighting where they weren't able to bring a bulk, their mass forces, into the Ottoman heartland. And eventually, after a year, they decided to evacuate, abandoning the military effort in order to preserve themselves as a fighting force. there were still opportunities for the UNSC, I would say at least halfway, 2/3 of the way through the story, that they might have been able to destroy enough Covenant, isolate those landing zones, and force the Covenant, much like the Anzac forces, to realize that the cost to them as a fighting force was too great, forcing them to evacuate and look for another plan. The only thing I think that Halo Reach as a narration was missing was a few more little like advanced aspects of warfare. What if they used cyber efforts to interfere with UNSC networks? It's not, they don't have a lot of strengths in the cyber realm, where we see in the games that humanity has a big advantage when it comes to like artificial intelligence, because the Covenant are in some ways a little bit brutish in how they approach technology. We didn't really see them use, or maybe they did, it just happens in the background, tactics like in Halo 2, small assault craft to covertly or overtly assault and destroy the MAC platforms in orbit, or more importantly, go after their guidance or C2, their command and control stations. Defeating that, you don't even have to take out all the guns. Instead, you just limit their ability to mass fires on the Covenant fleet, making it easier for them to infill more ships and secure victory. Everything else though, just playing through it and reading into the context, it all makes so much more sense. It's a much more methodical and coherent battle. Instead of lasting like a day or two, it lasts weeks. It's a grinding defeat for humanity. At the end of the day, I think Halo Reach just tells a much better story of delaying actions, the slow, steady defeat of humanity. It's more desperate, it's more emotionally gripping, watching your player character and the other Spartans that you've come to know die in combat, something that we don't really see and follow in Halo games. Spartans never die after Reach. We see the UNSC try their best, but it was never going to be enough. And the opening title scroll says exactly that. It was always going to fall. Maybe there were some ways that it could have been prevented, but eventually it did. And everyone who defended it died with them. And that's not different from the outcome of Fall of Reach. It just does it in a way that isn't like Covenant appear, Hulk smash, humanity's done. And it takes a little bit of cognitive dissonance to take the Covenant force that's able to just wipe out humanity in a day and then translate that to 5 years of combat for Harvest. The fact that humanity was able to mount such an effective defense on installation 04, or the fact that humanity was also able to hold out and mount an insurgency against Covenant forces on Earth up until they left via the Ark. That's my take though. I know it's probably very spicy and I'm gonna have a lot of comments telling me both that I am wrong and also the big dumb, and that's okay. This is all subjective in its opinion. And I just honestly at the end of the day really like talking about Halo. If you like this style of content, consider subscribing. I do weekly videos typically talking about realism, application engineering, whatever you're interested in as it relates to the Halo games. If you didn't like this video, that's okay too. Hopefully there's better content out there. Everyone have a fantastic weekend, be safe and take care.